Hello, everyone. So today we'll be dealing with Lafcadio Hearns on reading in relation to literature. So, as you know, this module is all about speeches, and this particular speech tells us about reading. Now, if you can, divide this speech, you can say that the first half of the speech is all about the act of reading. So it defines reading. What are the various ways in which you can read? And the second half of this speech tells us about the various kinds of books and how to distinguish between great books. So there again, he makes a compare and contrast sort of an analysis of reading and understanding various books. Now, the author of this wonderful speech is Lafcadio Hearn. He goes by his Japanese name, Koizumi Yakumo. He's actually an author and a writer of Japanese culture and aesthetics. Now, it is really strange that he grew up in the Greek island of Lefkada, and then he grew up in Dublin, and his education, early education, all happened in England. Now, he wrote both prose, poems, and scholarly essays on various radical themes. Especially after his migration to US, he was interested in the life of the urban blacks. And he was also interested in the historic and the Oriental writing. So there is a lot of Japanese influence of Japanese culture and aesthetics in his work. And even though he has been accused of exoticizing Japan, you find that in his poems there is this, I would say, an indelible link between Japan and West. And this particular speech that we have to study, it is on reading in relation to literature. So this is actually the first chapter of life and literature. So this is divided into two parts, like I said before. So the first part basically, analyzes the act of reading. And the second part is all about great works, great canons of literature. He talks about writers who have, they have, made a mark in literature. And he also talks about translations. So that's that. Let's move on to this wonderful speech on reading in relation to. So on reading in relation to literature is all about Lafcadio's take on the act of reading. So he begins his speech by saying, as the term approaches its close, I wish to keep my promise regarding a series of lectures relating to literary life and work to be given independently of texts or authorities and to represent as far as possible the result of practical experiences among the makers of literature in different countries. The subject for this term will be reading. And then he says that, yes, this may seem like a rather simple subject, but he says reading is not as simple as it appears. And then he begins his speech or lecture and he says that there are very few people who know how to read. So that I believe would shock all of us because all of us know how to read. But that is not the kind of reading that Lafcadio has in mind. So he says, considerable experience with literature is needed before taste and discrimination can possibly be acquired. And without these, it is impossible to learn how to read. So, like he said earlier, right before he began his speech, he says, reading is not something simple. Not everyone can read. Now, before you learn how to read, there are two other things that are very important. One is taste, and the other is discrimination. It is only if you have these two, I would say, qualities, will you be able to know how to learn to read. And therefore, he says, I say almost impossible, since there are some rare men who, through a natural inborn taste, through a kind of inherited literary instinct, are able to read very well even before reaching the age of 25 years. But these are great exceptions, and I'm speaking of the average. So he says that it is not, possible for everyone to be, become good readers. Very few people have that natural ability. It is not innate in everyone. Very few. There are few exceptional people who know or who are able to read very well even before they reach this peak age of 25 years. But Lafcadio says, I am not talking about these few exceptions. I'm not going to talk about the few, the elite, the ones who have this inborn quality of knowing how to read. I am speaking of average. I'm talking about the average number of people. So he says, what exactly is reading? Now, reading does not mean you're able to read the letters or words. That does not really constitute reading. Now, he says you will often find yourself reading words or characters automatically, pronouncing them correctly, while your minds are occupied with a totally different subject. That's exactly what we do when we are in class, right? You listen to the teacher, you're able to read the text, but your mind is elsewhere. Now, he says that this mere mechanism of reading becomes altogether automatic at an early period of life and can be performed irrespective of attention. So he says it's possible for all of us to pick up a book and automatically read the words, the characters, and it's like an automatic process. It is not as if you are conscious of what you're reading. Your mind and your heart is not 100% involved in this process of reading. Your mind is occupied elsewhere. So this is something that we all do. So he says, neither can I call it reading to extract the narrative portion of a text from the rest simply from one's personal amusement, or in other words, to read a book for the story. Yet, for the most of the reading that is done in the world is done in exactly this way. Right? So how do we read? What do we read? And why do we read? What do we read? We read everything. What do we read and how do we read it? We read things automatically. And why do you read? You want to know the story. So when you read a book for the story, that again does not really constitute reading, but that's how people consider it. Now, there are thousands and thousands of books that are being bought every year, every month. And who are the ones who buys, these books? By people who do not read at all. Now, I myself belong to this category, I believe, because I love to buy books. Most of the time, I can only read half of what I buy. So, when you go to a bookstore, it is a natural allure. You are attracted to I would say, these beautifully arranged books, and you think the titles call out to you. You buy those books, but do you read each and every single thing that you've bought? Not really. So they buy books just to amuse themselves, to kill time, as they call it. In 1 hour or two, their eyes have passed over all the pages, and there is left in their minds a vague idea or two about what they have been looking at. And this they really believe is reading, right? Now, when you travel somewhere, when you go somewhere, what do? You pick up a book. When you're traveling by train, there are these booksellers who come to your compartment. They sell books. You pick up those books, you buy, and then you just pass your eyes over it. You read the blurb, and then you kind of get the story, and that is it. And then you consider that to be reading. But that is not really reading. That is what Lafcadio was trying to say. So here he's telling us about the act of reading, and he says what we consider reading is not really reading. So even though we may end up reading thousands and hundreds and thousands of books each year, we may not really have read those books. We may not have done complete justice. So nothing is more common than to be asked, have you read such a book? Or to hear somebody say, I have read such and such a book. But these people do not speak seriously. Out of 1,000 persons who say, I have read this or I have read that, there is not one perhaps who's able to express any opinion worth hearing about what he has been reading. Now, when these people say that, I've read this book, I've read that book, I've read the Twilight series, I've read the Harry Potter series, how many of us can actually express our own opinions about the books that we have read? Very few. So if I were to ask you, or if I were to ask anyone who, who supposedly a voracious reader, if I were to ask that person, what do you think about this book? They may not really have an opinion of their own. It's very easy to express someone else's opinion, but it's impossible to have your own opinion on a particular book, on a particular subject. Anyway, so many and many a times I hear students say that they have read certain books, but if I ask them some questions regarding the book, I find that they are not able to make any answer, or at best they will only repeat something that somebody else has said about what they think that they have been reading. Now, is it only students who are, being accused of this particular technique of, handing over someone else's opinion? Not really. But this is not peculiar to students. It is in all countries. The way that the great public devours books. Now, if you go to any bookstore, if you go to any book exhibition, you have these, racks and racks of, uh, you know, books that are bestsellers, right? In various categories, and you have this feeling that you need to buy those books, all the bestsellers, whether it falls under the fiction category, the non-fiction, the young adult. You just have to, buy, and that is exactly what us, the public, that's what we do all the time. We devour, we just simply buy, and we try to finish reading these books. Now, and to conclude this introductory part of the lecture, I would say that the difference between a great critic and the common person is chiefly that the great critic knows how to read and the common person does not. No man is really able to read a book who's not able to express an original opinion regarding the contents of a book. So then how are we different from a great critic? Now, I would consider myself to be a common person. Now, the way I read would be very different from how a critic would read a book. So now, what exactly is the difference between the great critic and me? The difference is that a great critic will be able to, come up with his or her own original opinion about the book, the content of the book, the form of the book. And a common man like me, or us for that matter, we may not be able to do it. So now the author comes and he is done with the introductory part of his lecture. He says, no doubt you will think that this statement of the case confuses reading with study. You might say, when we read history or philosophy or science, then we do read very thoroughly, studying all the meanings and bearings of the text slowly and thinking about it. This is hard study. But when we read a story or a poem out of class hour, we read for amusement. Amusement and study are two different things. I'm not sure that you all think this, but young men generally do so. As a matter of fact, every book worth reading ought to be read in precisely the same way that a scientific book is read, not simply for amusement. And every book worth reading should have the same amount of value in it that a scientific book has, though the value may be of a totally different kind. So he says, when I tell you about what reading is, then you would automatically you would be ready to counter me and say that this is not reading, this is studying. You would probably say that yes, when I study my my portions, when I study my subject, then I would read all the text thoroughly. I would go through the meanings, I would go through everything little by little, bit by bit, very slowly. And he says, students would probably call this hard study. But Lafcadio says this is how we should read poem or story. Even if we are reading it for amusement, there shouldn't really be a difference in the way in which we read. Just like you would read a scientific book, you ought to read other books also similarly. Whether it is for amusement, whether it is for study, the way and manner in which you read ought to be the same. So even though amusement and study are two different things, we ought to read books in the same way that we would read a scientific book. Because he says that, yes, the value that we receive from reading a story or a poem or a scientific book would be very different, but the values may be different, but that is exactly how you're supposed to read. For after all, the good book of fiction or romance or poetry is a scientific work. It has been composed according to the best principles of more than one science, but especially according to the principles of the great science of life, the knowledge of human nature. So there is again this notion that it's very easy to read a story or a poem, because after all, what exactly is a poem? He says it is not really right, because whether it is a novel, whether it is a short story, whether it's a poem, those works are also written according to certain rules. It follows, I would say, a strict protocol. There is a structure for it. There is a format for it, and it is only by following it do we end up getting this thing called fiction, romance, or poetry. And if you look at such works, you find that it also delivers knowledge, knowledge of human nature, which, according to Lafcadio, is the greatest science of life. Now, in regard to foreign books, this is especially true. So he says, we're talking about hard study. Now, what if we were to read books that is not written in our language, language that is not our own? Then how would you read? So this hard study would be impossible, wouldn't it? Nevertheless, Lafcadio says, how many English men can read a good book in English? And how many French men can read a great book in their own language? He says, not many. And if you look at the rate of publication, because every year in London, you have an upwards of 6,000 books that are being published. But very little reading is being done by the average public. So books are being written, they are being sold, and they're being read after a fashion, or rather according to a fashion, he says. Now, just like all of us like to follow fashion, Lafcadio understands that there is a fashion in literature as well. And what is this? There is a fashion in literature as well as in everything else, and a particular kind of amusement being desired by the public, a particular kind of reading is given to supply the demand. Now, to give you a very simple example, in the beginning, I'm sure you may agree or may not agree with me. Chetan Bhagat, all of us like, we love to read his works. But then after a while, we realize something. All of his books, most of his books at least, they are they have a similar pattern. There is this, I would say, a particular stereotypical pattern to his work. So it is because of the demand. We like a certain kind of book, and because there is a demand, we like such books. You find that writers are compelled to supply, meet with this demand. So, what has happened to literature? The quality of literature has been affected. So useless have become to this public the arts and graces of great real literature, that great thoughts which should belong to a great book, that men of letters have almost ceased to produce true literature. So it's all about marketing now. It is all about fashion. It is all about trying to cater to the demands of the public. And what has been compromised? True literature. True literature of great quality has been compromised. People want to write books so that it can be sold. They don't write great works of great value anymore. So you find that men of letters, they have almost stopped producing true literature. Now, Lafcadio says when a man can obtain great deal of money by writing a book without style or beauty, a mere narrative to amuse, and knows at the same time that if he should give 3, 5, or 7 years to the production of a really good book, he would probably starve to death. He is forced to be untrue to the higher duties of his profession. And what exactly is the profession? To produce great, true literature. Now, a great writer would know something, and that is that you have to struggle. You would have to dedicate your time and energy, and that would be maybe 3 to 5 to even 10 years, and only then can you produce great work. But then that would mean too much. That would mean the writer would probably starve to death because he needs money. And so what happens is that money matters are given more priority. Men start writing impossibly trivial works to entertain the public because they just want their books to be sold. Their books need not be of great value, but it needs to be sold. So you find that men happily situated in regards to money matters might possibly attempt something great from time to time, but they can hardly get a hearing. So then what happens? Taste has so much deteriorated within the past few years that, as I'm told, I've told you before, style has practically disappeared, and style means thinking. And this is a state of things in England has been largely brought about by bad habits of reading, by not knowing how to read. So the fact that the taste has been compromised, that is, the people are not, they don't think anymore. It's all bad books, bad reading, not knowing how to read, which has contributed to this decline in the value and the quality of literature. And so he brings it back to this idea of what great, good reading is. So now he's going to tell us what to do. So he says, what a scholar should keep in mind. The first thing that he needs to keep in mind is that a book needs to be read not simply for amusement. A half educated person might read for amusement and nobody would blame them for it because they are not really educated, are they? So they are incapable of appreciating the deeper qualities that belong to really great literature. But what about a scholar? But a young man who has passed through the course of university training should discipline himself at an early day never to read for mere amusement. So he says, a scholar, a person who has, college degree should never read a book simply to, pass time or for amusement. And once the habit of discipline has been formed, so the habit of discipline is something that young scholars entering university, finishing, passing through the course of university training should inculcate, and that is the habit of discipline. And the first thing that person should do is not read anything for amusement. And once you inculcate this habit of discipline, what will happen? You will not be able to read for amusement. So he will then impatiently throw down any book from which he cannot obtain intellectual food. So once you develop this discipline, once you get into this habit of reading for value, reading for the deeper qualities of a book, what will happen to you? The way you read would automatically change. You will be frustrated when you read a book, a book that is not of great value. You will throw down such a book. Any book that does not appeal to your intellect or your higher emotions will irritate you. So that is what you need to do. You need to develop this discipline, this ability to read a book, not for amusement, but rather read it like you would read a scientific book. But it is very difficult to form this habit. So now he says the habit of reading for amusement. Now it is the opposite. This habit of reading for amusement, which is a very bad habit, he says it is kind of like the habit of drinking wine or opium smoking or narcotic, right? Which is easy for us to develop a bad habit or a good habit. It is always easier for us to develop bad habits rather than good habits. Alle? So it's like you're drinking wine, you're drinking, other kind of intoxicating drinks, or doing drugs. All those become very easy for you, even though they're like really bad. And reading books, which is something very good, it's like a good quality. It's very difficult for us to form good habit. So he says, something that keeps up a perpetual condition of dreaming, something that eventually results in destroying all capacity for thought, giving exercise only to the surface part of the mind and leaving the deeper springs of feelings and the higher faculties of perception unemployed. So again, he's basically comparing and contrasting two habits. One is the habit of forming discipline, and the second would be the habit of reading for amusement. So now we're going to delve deeper into this idea of reading. So now we are going to figure out what happens when we read for amusement. So you find Lafcadio, he's giving us a good example. He says there is this young clerk. You just imagine such a situation. There is this young clerk. He is a person who reads every day. Okay, that is on his way to his office and on his way back as well. And why does he read? Just to pass the time. And what does he read? He's reading a novel. Why? It's very easy to read novels. Why? They're very simple, and there's always a story. And once you get the story, you're able to understand it. This is very easy work. And why does he read it? Because he can forget all his problems. When you're simply sitting, when you're traveling, you think of things, right? You think of things that are troubling you. So he does not want to do that. So this young clerk, on his way to work and on his way back as well, he reads novels. And why does he read it? To forget his problems. He wants to dull his mind to all the problems that he has. So in 1 day or 2 days, he finishes the novel. And the very next day, he reads another novel. And then he finishes that also. And then that it continues. He goes on buying novels and he goes on reading novels. And by the end of 1 year, he would have read between 150 and around 200 novels. So now, whether he's very poor or not, book reading is not something very expensive, right? You can always buy books. Now, even if you cannot buy books, you always have the option of, going to the libraries and buying, lending, borrowing books, right? So you have lending libraries, you have circulating libraries. So, and then what happens at the end of all this? At the end of few years, this clerk, he would have read at least thousands of novels. Now, let us understand what happens to the novels that he has read. Now, does he like those novels? No. He will not like all the novels that he has read. And most of the time, he'd probably say that most of the novels are the same and that he did not seriously read them. He just wanted to, while away his time. And that the books, of course, are necessary for him because he would have been very unhappy or troubled without the book. But then, what is the function of the book? It is almost like a sedative, right? The sedative that you take for sleeping or forgetting about the pain and the problems in your life. It's almost like taking drugs. So, what has this man accomplished? He has read thousands of books, but he does not remember the names of 20 or 30 books out of the thousands he has read. And he does not remember the content, probably the characters of the story. So, then this whole reading is what? It is nothing but it creates a cloudiness in his mind. It troubles his mind, or there is this confusion like a cloud. That is the direct result, he says. And what is the indirect result? The indirect result is he has not developed, he has not learned anything from this. So you find that all development necessarily means some pain. You need some. There is no gain without pain. So you need to take some effort. And if you do not, simply reading is contributing to atrophy. And what exactly is atrophy? This page 52, girls. Atrophy is muscle wasting, loss of brain cells. When you're simply reading something, you're wasting your time, you're wasting your, I don't know, brain cells, you're wasting your muscles are probably wasting away. So, of course, this is an extreme case, but it is the ultimate outcome of reading for amusement. So, this is what happens when you read for amusement. Of course, this is slightly exaggerated, but the idea is quite, I would say, sensible. The idea is clear to us, isn't it? So, the outcome of reading for amusement, whenever such amusement becomes a habit, They are means close at hand to gratify the habit. At present in Japan, there is little danger of this state of things. But I use the illustration for the sake of its ethical warning, he says. So, how do we read a book? And what are the books that we need to keep with us? And what are the books that we should not read, which should be shunned? So, a good novel is just as good reading as even the greatest philosopher can possibly wish for. So, the whole matter depends upon the way of reading, even more than the nature of what is read. So, there is not a single book which has nothing good in it. It depends upon the reader and how he reads. So, it is a habit of the reader than the art of the writer. That would be the outcome. So, the result, the end result of reading, what do you gain at the end of it? That depends not on the writer, but rather on the habit of reader, how you read a work. Now, since we are talking about how to read, the best method would be, you know, becoming a child. Because if you look at, a child's method of observation, a child's method of reading would be the best, it would be the apt way of reading. Because children, they are very curious by nature. They always have questions. They observe everything. There is nothing that escapes them. They see, they observe every single thing. Even the minutest details do not escape children. So a child's method of observation and a child's method of reading is something that we as adults should adopt. Because when a child reads, he reads thoroughly. And when he's reading, he's also thinking. He does not think about the world outside, but he thinks about what he is reading. And he thinks about it untiringly. And when and after he's read a fairy tale, he will think about that one story for a month. So that one little fairy tale will give him mental occupation for a month after he has read it. So all the energies of his little fancies are exhausted upon the tale, and if his parents be wise, they do not allow him to read a second tale until the pleasure of the first and its imaginative effect has begun to die away. So as parents, you give a child one book and wait for that the power of that one book to to be to diminish, to be exhausted. Only then will you give that child another book, because that is how deep and for how long that child can read a book and experience that book. And that becomes the true, I would say, quality of a good reader. So now, of course, let us leave aside the child's attentive reading. Now, let us come to a professional reader or a scientific reader. And we'll understand that just like a child, the same power has been developed by the professional or the scientific reader. Yeah, if you go to the publishing houses, what happens in a publishing house? On a daily basis, thousands and thousands of books are being approved. There are manuscripts that are being sent by amateur writers, established writers even. So then, a publishing house is a very busy place where all these manuscripts, all these future bestsellers, possible bestsellers are being written, are being read, they're being reviewed, judged. So, who does the judging? Who does the reading? And how do they read these manuscripts? So, in these publishing houses, it is these professional readers. What do? They read all the manuscripts, they look, they judge, and it is this what happens in the publishing houses done by the professional reader. So, who is a professional reader? A professional reader is not an ordinary man. He is a scholar. He is a person who has an uncommon capacity. And what do you mean by this uncommon capacity? Now, if you get around 16,000 manuscripts each year, so in a publishing house, you would have to read these manuscripts at a very quick rate. So how can you read it? Isn't it impossible? So out of 1,000 manuscripts, this professional reader will read perhaps not more than one. Out of 2,000, he may possibly read three. The others, he simply looks at for a few seconds. One glance is enough for him to decide whether the manuscript is worth reading or not. The shape of a single sentence will tell him that from the literary point of view. So, this man must be a genius because he does not read all the 16,000 manuscripts. He only reads one or three. Others, he'll simply look, he'll simply glance at the other one. But how does he come to that? How does he decide? How can one glance be enough? How can the shape of a single sentence tell him that it's going to be a good book? Even the title is enough for him to judge. Some manuscripts may receive a minute or even 5 minutes of his attention. Very few receive a longer consideration. Out of 16,000, we can assume that 16 are selected. So out of 16,000, let us imagine that 16 books, 16 manuscripts are chosen. Then what happens? Out of the 16,000, he will read those 16 from the beginning to the end. After he reads it, from the 16, he will eliminate and he will only keep 8 aside. And then what does he do with the 8 books? The 8 books he would read again the second time. That was the second time he will read it very carefully. And then he would probably take away one. Now, the 7 books that he has with him, he will read again. Now, a professional, reader, he will know not to read them immediately. Why? He's just finished reading them. So, what does he do? He will leave them. He will leave all those 7 books in his drawer. Okay, he'll keep it in his almari or he'll keep it in his drawer, he'll keep it in his table, he'll forget about it. And he will wait for an entire week. And then what happens? At the end of the week, he will try to see whether he can remember the 7 stories, the 7 manuscripts, and what the 7 books hold, the qualities. Now, very clearly, he'll only remember 3 out of the 7. And then he realizes that he's able to remember two more, but two he has forgotten. The works that don't really make an impression, that are not very attractive to him, he will leave that aside. He then takes the manuscripts out of the drawer and then he condemns the two, the ones he cannot remember. And then out of the seven, he has taken away five. So now he's taken away two. Now we have five with us. And then what does he do with he reads them for the third time. Now, the third time he reads the five books, the five manuscripts, everything is judged. He scrutinizes the subject, how the author has executed his plot, his thought, the literary quality of the work, and then he discovers something. Three are discovered to be first class, two are accepted by the publishers only as second class, and that is the end. Now, something like this is what happens in great publishing houses.